Hey everyone, I'm Ben. I'm an animator,
And I'm John, and I'm a comics writer.
and welcome to the Up and Coming Artist Podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back. Ben here, and I am so excited to share with you guys this interview with John Sollitto, who, as we just said, is a comics writer, but he's done so much in the entertainment arts, and that's why I've kind of split this interview into two parts. In this first part, we talk about John's work in casting, which is how I met him, casting for voices for TV and animation. John's also worked in video games, and we'll get into that in a second. It's really interesting stuff. And but we mostly talk about in this interview John creating his own comic Veritas. So we get into history of growing up on comics and finding his artists, which is really cool. Shout out to him. I'll give the social media handles for John and his artist. And then John also gives advice about writing in this episode. And then in part two, we'll cover more specifically John's comic. So I hope you guys enjoy this episode and more shout outs at the end. John, thanks for coming on, man.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, dude. Despite all of our technical difficulties, particularly mine, we made it.
Yeah, it took a long time, but this is the pinnacle of technology. Is two of us talking to each other over a video, platform with no video, just audio.
Yeah. It'll be perfect. We'll be having the listener experience because this is an audio only podcast anyway.
That's the true natural beauty of the podcast. Then.
That's right. It makes it so I never have to clean my room or do really any work to get ready for this.
You know what? I 100% get behind that. As someone
Yeah.
who is terrible at cleaning his room as well, I really feel that on a spiritual level.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense because you're a busy guy. You have a lot going on. So, for everyone listening to this, John and I met while at Stupid Buddy. So, for those of you who've been listening to the podcast for a while, I am an assistant animator at Stupid Buddy Studios, which, along with making the show that I work on called Crossing Swords, their biggest show, the one that everyone knows Stupid Buddy for, is Robot Chicken, which John was helping out on not too long ago. And what were you doing on the show, John?
I was a casting assistant for Robot Chicken for a few months there. My job was essentially to collate all the paperwork for the talent that came on the show and help them get it signed so that then payroll at Stupid Buddy could help, facilitate payment after the records.
And this is totally an aside from the rest of the episode, which we'll talk about comic writing, which I'm so excited to talk with you about. But just as a quick aside, how did you even get involved in casting?
Well, my sister and her business partner are casting directors, and they work right now primarily in animation, though they do live action work as well. But I was moving back down to Southern California, and as I was moving down, I was looking for a job and a place to stay. And my sister was like, "Well, I need a casting assistant right now. We're doing a lot of work for all the shows that we're doing. We would really appreciate your help." So I ended up helping her out and her business partner. So I would kind of hop between a bunch of the shows that they had, but I was primarily at Stupid Buddy for Robot Chicken, where I was helping with all of that.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, and now and once again, sorry, we're doing all the asides so that for the rest of the episode, we can just get into comic writing. Um, but now, just for everyone listening, because most people listening to this podcast got interested in art either due to anime or particularly through video games, I just wanted to say real quick that you work for a video game company right now, correct?
I do now, yeah. Before I was a casting assistant, I had worked in the video game industry in the Bay Area for about 6 or 7 years as a QA tester. And
Wow.
I bounced around from companies like EA, Sledgehammer, it's one of the subsidiaries of Activision. And then the last company I worked at was Telltale before the great collapse that occurred
Yes.
wherein Telltale went bankrupt. I was there for that.
Wow.
So I had been there for about 2 months before, we were all called into a room and they were like, everyone has to go.
Oh my God.
So that was you know what? And in the video game industry, you dodge layoffs all the time. It's kind of the way that that industry works. It's either a layoff or a quote unquote company restructuring, or most studios lose about a third of their people after every published title because someone says I want to move on, and then you lose about a third of your staff, and then people get moved up or they hire more. So it's common for people to be in and out of there, but that was the last company that I was at, and that was the first time I'd been laid off. And it was rough because I was out of work for about 6 months in that industry, couldn't really find anything. Nobody was really hiring. QA is also a very specialized position wherein there's a lot of people who can do QA, but there's not a lot of people who can do QA well.
Yeah. And what is that for people listening?
Oh, okay. Quality assurance testing is kind of like the last line of defense that game companies have before they give their products out to the consumer. QA people, depending on your level of QA, because there is gradations of quality assurance testing, you've got your functionality testers who basically get the closest to complete version of whatever you're working on, and they run through it to make sure that it actually works. And that can be anything from walking down a hallway 100 times to make sure that the game doesn't crash, to making sure your menus function properly, which is a really big, important thing in a game.
Right.
A lot of people think it's like, oh, you're just playing the game all day, every day. You're lucky if you get to play the game, honestly.
Yeah.
It's very much we would call that ad hoc testing, where you kind of just don't really have an agenda for the moment. You're waiting on something for somebody else. Just play the game and see if you can find anything weird, is called ad hoc testing. Usually you have a specified thing that you're looking for all the time. When I worked on The Sims 4, my job was primarily focused on the build-buy mechanic, so basically building houses and buying things to go into the house.
Wow.
So my day-to-day life was making sure you could build a house. So I would build houses all day and realize like, oh, I can't put a door here. If I put the floor down first and I put the wall up first and I put railing here, the door doesn't work.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I would rarely get to actually play with The Sims. I would
Yeah.
actually only be playing with the houses for a long time, and then eventually I'd be like, okay, now I want to see if the sim can sit down. I didn't really do a lot of the jobs or any of the interpersonal things that the Sims could do. I was testing around what the Sims could do with the houses.
Wow. That's crazy. So then that would probably require QA testing for just about everything in the game, right?
Yeah, yes. Sims 4 was an interesting beast, and it was probably the most complicated game I ever worked on because it's about 5 or 6 different types of simulations in one game.
Oh
And
my
it's
gosh.
got old code from Sims 1 that they never got rid of because they're just like, this is the way it works, and we don't want to change it because if we do, it's like a Jenga tower. You pull one piece of code, everything breaks.
Right. Yeah.
And that's something you notice when working in games a lot is if someone changes a word from blue to green, suddenly everything's purple for no reason.
Oh wow.
And you're like, why did this happen? And then
Yeah.
one guy just goes like, oh, I was putting grass down and I didn't realize that would change the color of the water. And you're like, why would that happen? And they're like, we
Yeah.
don't know. We have to figure it out. And that's a
Wow.
thing that happens every day, all the time, no matter what, up until launch, up until it gets to the player, because then some player is going to be like, hey, if I put this, mushroom here, all the garden gnomes start dancing, and you're like, I don't
Yeah.
understand how that would
Yeah.
happen. And
It's
why would you
awesome,
even,
but
yeah, it's like
yeah.
it's funny, but like why would you do that? And they're like, well, I
Right.
wanted the mushroom right there. And you're like, fine, thanks, all right, we need to make a patch now. Or if you're the Sims, you just kind of say, screw it, the fans like it, which is
Yeah.
how Sims got floating houses. there's
Oh my
there's a
gosh.
way in the Sims that if you build 2-story houses and then you delete the bottom floor, the house that is the house kind of still floats there. um and that was a bug that they never got out of Sims 2, and fans loved it so much they're like, nah, just keep it in.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Now I was gonna say, um, do game developers or people in QA like yourself watch like these what do you call it, like speed runs, where people are relying on basically the cheats or broken elements of the game to like get through it quick? Does it frustrate you, or is it kind of awesome, like, hey, they figured it out?
It's kind of like six of one, half a dozen of the other. When I worked on Sims, I couldn't watch my girlfriend at the time play
Oh really?
because I was like, you're doing it wrong. And it's not that she's doing it wrong. She just had a way that she was playing it that is her way of playing. And I had been 8 hours a day every day for 2 years doing it one way. And it
Right.
was weird watching someone do it a different way. When I worked on Call of Duty, I worked on Call of Duty World War II for a long time, for about
Oh.
another 2 year period. Um, we would watch people stream the game, and it was research because we'd be looking. I worked on both, or actually, I worked on single player, multiplayer, and the zombies situation.
Mm.
So I kind of saw all the aspects of the game. So I'd watch people play single player and be like, okay, there's a bug there, or this is where they're stuck. Okay, that's something to know for next time. Um, for multiplayer, it was like, what are the guns that everybody's using?
Mm.
Did we test around that a lot? Wow, that guy found a way to cheat by hiding in this location and nobody can see him. Is there something we can do about that? For zombies, it was how quickly can they solve these puzzles? Do we need to make
Hmm.
the puzzles harder? Are they stuck? Are they actually finding a bug or are they complaining because the puzzle's too hard?
Mm.
It's a lot of
Yeah.
that kind of thing where there is someone who is usually all the time got Twitch up on their screen watching someone.
Wow.
And they're just like, hey, can we check this level? Because it looks like somebody's having trouble with this. And then sure enough, someone on my team will go, got it. And then they go and they do that all day. And it's someone somewhere is doing that all the time,
Wow.
constantly,
That's so
especially when the
cool.
game is live. So it's kind of one of those, and that's usually how we do, like I said, market research is what do the fans want? What are they missing? What don't they like? Because the people who have a platform are usually the people who are the most vocal.
Mm-hmm. Right. And people get behind them about whatever it is that they're doing, and then that's coming to you guys. Oh, that's crazy. Now, it's interesting that we live in a time now where that's the way it's being done. Whereas, obviously, before Twitch and other streaming services, were you just, waiting to just kind of hear back, like, but now it's live. That's crazy.
It's a very interesting dynamic to find yourself in when a lot of the time the fire and forget sort of mentality of game design was like, well, God willing, they like this. And now that the internet exists, it's like, I will know within 12 hours if they hate our game.
Wow.
And because Twitter's a thing.
Yeah.
Someone's live tweeting or someone's Twitch streaming, and for zombies, I know we had a running daily counter for when someone would beat the DLC, and they would
Mm-hmm.
they would have bets. They're like, all right, I think it'll take them 12 hours. I think it'll take 18. I think it'll do this. And we just sit there and someone would be watching the highest level streamers who usually beat the mode, and they've got a counter running next to them. And they're
Wow.
just watching and waiting. They're like, we're at 12, and then we'd cross out the 12 prediction. And then, we're like, okay, how long are we going to go? How long are we going to go? And the funny part about those groups is they talk to each other on the different streams.
Mm.
So, zombie player over here who's figured out a puzzle, his viewers will go to somebody else's stream, tell that streamer how she can beat the puzzle, and then they're all at the same level now.
Oh, wow.
And so they all kind of progress at the same time as a group, and because they're like a weird sort of hive mind community. So
Yeah.
I saw a streamer. She was having trouble with this puzzle, and then someone with a username from another chat that we were watching jumped into her channel and was like, "Hey, so and so figured it out. All you have to do is this." And she goes, "Oh, thank God!" And then she figured it out, and
Wow.
then she would
It's
figure
faster
something
and
out.
faster, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was fascinating to watch. We were just like, "Wow, that's nuts." And conversely, comics is kind of the same way because you had the letters to the editor situation back in old comics that you'd have to
Mm.
wait months to see your letter come in, and those would be curated by the editor in chief or somebody like that, and those would be in the back of the book. Now it's like when your comic is live, someone could text you and be like, "This sucks," and you're like, "Oh, thanks."
Yeah.
Like, I appreciate that.
Yeah, well, that's great, John, and that's what's cool too. That's why I gave that little aside because you've done a lot in the entertainment arts, and so you have a lot of experience. And I think your transition is perfect. It's exactly what I wanted to get into today, which is writing your comic Veritas. So not only do you have your comment section at the end of each of your pages, which is what we were just talking about, that immediate response, but just the fact that you have this fully fledged comic that you're releasing updates for like 3 times a week. It's incredible on these social media platforms. So it's awesome that you've taken advantage of kind of all these things you've learned from these other areas of entertainment that you've worked in and applying it to your comic now. I think that's super rad.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's also a lot of doing the homework. I mean, I was very lucky that I was dating somebody for a time who was a marketing manager, and she was very gracious about talking to me, being like, "Hey, I see that you're doing this. Maybe if you thought about doing it this way, you might get more response, or these are the biggest platforms at the moment. Maybe you should think about doing that." And it was a lot of being humble enough to take advice from people who knew more about things than I did, and doing research on like webtoons and tapas and things like
Hmm.
that to understand, like, okay, these are the things that people are normally doing. These are the comics that I read. Those are kind of an outlier on the web. Maybe I should find my own platform. Which one's free? Which one do I have to pay for? Is it worth it? And it's taking your ego out of the equation and trying to be like, okay, what's best for the thing, not what do I want to do. And that's
Hmm.
really hard.
Yeah. Well, and just doing all that stuff in general, I think sometimes when I think about creating a comic, thinking about the advertising and marketing and getting it out there on social media isn't even an aspect that crosses my mind. So I think it's awesome, but it's also so much work. So I think it's really cool that you've put that all out there and are getting your comic for people to read.
Well, thank you. And it is a lot of work. I mean, it's some days they were like, oh crap, I forgot to, publish today, or oh no, I got to do this thing. And, and
Yeah.
it's a lot of doing one job while you're at a second job. And, my 9 to 5 is my primary source of income. It is, where I need to be to do the things that I want to do. And as much as I would love to sit around all day and write comics and write books and all the things that I want to write, things cost money. And, my artist deserves to get paid because I love his work so very much.
Hmm.
And I want to make sure that I have a reputation as someone who appropriately and properly compensates the people that he works with. And that's another one of those things where you're just like, I have to do this work so that I put my money where my mouth is, kind of a thing.
Hmm.
You can't be someone that people want to work with if you aren't doing the work to make them feel appreciated. That's why I always credit my artist whenever I try and post a picture from the comic, because I want people to know that this is not my art, this is his art. I am very lucky to be working with him. Please go follow him. He is really good at his
Yeah.
job. Because my hope is that down the line somebody approaches him for another job and they give him work because they see him on Veritas. I'm not,
Yeah.
saying that, oh, my comic is so, widely read. It's more like, on the
He's
off
doing good
chance.
work.
Yeah, this is his portfolio too, and I recognize that. And while people go like, oh, you shouldn't pay someone with exposure, I'm like, I'm not. I'm paying him per page, and I'm giving him exposure. I want him to succeed just as much as I want to succeed. So at any chance, I'm going to scream his name from every rooftop because he deserves to see that. And that is Davis Dominguez. Um,
Shout out.
yeah, no, this is definitely a good point for that. I'm going to actually find his Twitter handle so that you can really see it. And
Perfect.
he does incredible art. Um, and he does a lot of pro work for other companies as well as for Veritas. He on Twitter he is at Davis GD, so it's at DEIVISGD, and he's just such a phenomenal artist. I think he even does
Hmm.
most of it by hand on pencil first, and
Wow.
then he inks it digitally, and some of his art is so incredible. And I'm like, oh, like I'll see his stuff, and for other comics, I'm like, oh man,
Hmm.
now I want him to do that for me.
Yeah.
It's like, every now and then I'll see him do like some fantasy thing or something sci-fi. I'm like, oh, how do I get a
Get it
spaceship
into
into this
mine. Yeah.
comic now? Because I want him to draw a spaceship, and it's so fun to just watch him do other stuff. And obviously, it's like, oh, it kind of takes time away from my project, but I'm like, I need the break too. You know?
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. Well, yeah, and we do need to shout him out because his work really is fantastic. Not only does he have Just fantastic character design and a great understanding of anatomy, but even all the backgrounds and everything's in perspective, and like characters based on what you've written are flying through the city, and that's hard to draw. So that's really cool, and just a fantastic find. And since we're talking about that, how did you get connected with this artist? Because as you're talking about, shouting out his name and sharing his work everywhere, and by the way, every freelance artist listening to this thanks you. Uh, how did you get connected to him in order to do the art for Veritas?
So there are a lot of websites that um, artists of any kind of caliber, concept artists, sequential, I shouldn't say caliber, I say genre really. Um, Sequential artists, so people who do, comics or animation artists, concept
Stories.
artists. Yeah, exactly, storyboard artists. Um, there's a lot of websites for them to kind of post portfolios. That's kind of more of an artistically geared kind of Craigslist sort of a vibe. And my girlfriend and I, we were looking through these, and she found him. She's like, "This is the guy that you want to work with you." And I honestly, I trusted her far more in artistic taste than I had, frankly. And she was right. She was
Hmm.
absolutely 100% right. And he responded very quickly, I think within a couple days. And he he was like, "Yeah, sure. I like the idea of this." I think we talked over Skype for a little bit, a couple times. Um, and he was like, "This is a really interesting idea. I'd really like to work on this." And I go, "Okay, cool." And then we kind of talked price, and it was a little bit of a negotiation because, I am not made of money, but I also
Yeah.
wanted to make sure that I paid him. And I said, "Okay, like let's kind of meet in the middle here somewhere. How much more can I get you? How much little, how little is too little for you? What would make you feel comfortable?" Which is also something you really have to learn how to do as a creator of any caliber. Because if you're hiring a writer or a colorist or another artist or something like that, or even a graphic designer or a social media person, knowing their worth and knowing what you can pay is a very weird thing that a lot of people don't want to talk about because it's uncomfortable.
Right.
It's uncomfortable to tell someone you don't have that much money, or because you don't want to sound like, "I don't think you're worth it."
Hmm.
You don't want to
Right.
say it's kind of what you're trying to avoid saying is, "I can't pay that because I don't have the money," which is embarrassing. And you're also not wanting to say, "I don't want to pay that," because then it comes off as that person goes, "You're not valuing my work." So
Right.
it's a lot of biting the bullet and making that decision for yourself. And I understand that that's a privilege to be able to pay those things. If you can't, that's okay.
Hmm.
That's fine. Um, Talk to the person that you're hiring, tell them your situation. If they don't understand or if they can't accommodate it, that's fine.
Hmm.
Maybe this um, business venture at the moment with this specific person isn't right now. Maybe down the line, absolutely. But part of what's really important is getting your thing in front of people. And that was what I really liked about Davis was he was like, "No, let's do this. Let's draw this. Let me show you what I can do. Let's do a little bit of a concept work." And he was very adamant about getting it seen, and I wanted to
Mm.
have it seen as well. And so after I had spoken with him for a while, and we had worked on the first couple of issues that were finished, I kind of sat on them for a while because I wanted them to be perfect. I wanted them to be in
Hmm.
color, and I wanted them to have this beautiful, all the bells and whistles. Again, what I wanted, not what I could do. And it took a lot of conversations with my girlfriend then at the time with like, "I want to wait till it's perfect." And she's gonna be like, "How long are you gonna wait?
Mm.
How long is this going to
Yeah.
sit on a shelf and you're not going to show it to anybody? And how is that fair to him? And how is that fair to you?" Um, and it was hard too because I wanted it to be a better representation of my work and put my best foot forward. But at the end of the day, just having something is your best foot forward. If you've got stick
Yeah.
figures and a bunch of jokes and you want to write newspaper comics, just make that and show it because it shows that you can complete something. And that is honestly, that's what separates you from people who don't do that.
Right.
Everybody's a writer until it comes to showing their work.
Mm.
I guarantee anyone you talk to on the street, in a Starbucks, in your apartment complex, someone's writing a book somewhere. The only thing that separates you from them is whether or not your work is in front of people.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing wrong with being a hobbyist and not showing your work and loving your work. Those people are writers too.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to be a professional, which is a weird thing to say, that I kind of, I guess, am now, if you want to be someone who is a professional at writing, you have to put your work in front of people because otherwise it's just a hobby. And that's
Mm-hmm.
great. You know, people paint for a hobby, people, animate for a hobby, and it's not for money and it's not for what it's just for pure love of the game, 100%, that's awesome. And that's the purest best feeling is creating something and just being like, ah, man, I love to create. And that's awesome.
Yeah.
But if you want to do this for a living, or if this is your career, or if this is something that you want to pursue, you have to do the thing.
Yeah, and get it out there, right? Like Davis and your girlfriend and like what you're saying. That's awesome. And so without further ado, let's get into it. And for everyone listening, how I learned that John wrote Veritas because he's a very humble guy. He was working on casting a stupid buddy, and I was just going around the studio and asking people what their favorite comics were because I've been really wanting to get back into it. Um, and so I was just, chatting it up with John upstairs, and he just kind of casually throws in like, "Yeah, this is kind of what I do for my comic." And I was like, "What? You write a comic?" So what I want to get into is kind of that conversation that we had back then, and that is, how did Veritas even come about? Like, did you grow up on comics? Was this just something you always wanted to do as a passion project? How did this begin?
I'm pretty certain that I learned to read on comics
Oh,
at a
wow.
very early age. I definitely remember a very dog-eared and worn late 90s X-Men comic that I read all the time that I like for the life of me don't know where it is now, but I'm pretty sure it had to do with the Mojo verse, and a lot of that's a lot of storylines and I have never seen before when X-Men was like not even a thing I was reading at like 10. It's like this was like X-Men like 275 and I'm like, why did I have this? It's not like I
Yeah.
was collecting for 10 years. I wasn't even alive when X-Men 1 came out. Um, I don't know how I got it, but then, my parents read comics. My dad's a big sci-fi reader. My mom, I think, was reading Star Trek comics at the time. My sister would read Archie and Sailor Moon.
Mm.
So there, comics were never a silly thing in my house. Which a lot of people have that struggle when they grow up of like their parents thinking that comics aren't really literature or something like that. Um, yeah, my parents were not, weird about that. So I kind of grew up reading comics, and then there were those tie-in comics to the Batman and Superman and animated shows in the 90s that I got. And so I was like, okay, like it was kind of like connecting the dots between the things that I liked
Hmm.
and, reading comics that were related to that. And it was cool to kind of see that. And then I kind of fell off on them for a while because, I started having to read more books for school, and I started to, at a certain point you have to learn how to read big books,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is important. And
Right.
no knocking comics, but it's like sometimes you have to learn how to read books with no pictures in them and use your imagination, and that's fun too. Um, and eventually, I think I decided, you do that thing when you're a kid. You're like, I want to be a fireman or whatever kind of a thing.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, I want to write books. And then it was video games, and then it was comics, and then it was books again, and then it was video games, and then it was books again. And I kind of toyed around with a lot of it and I stopped talking about comics because I was like, I can't draw them, and I don't want to look for an artist, so I'm just going to do books.
Mm.
And I started writing books that were awful for so long. Um, and it's one of
When
those
you
things
were
where
young at this
oh
point,
yeah,
right?
sure.
Like,
Yeah, I was
yeah.
like 16, 17 writing books, and this is when like fan fiction was just really starting, and you were on those,
Uh-huh.
Archive of Our Own, and all those uh, what is it like book specific fantasy fiction sites like the Harry Potter specific like
Yeah,
fan
that's what I
fiction
was gonna
sites and stuff
say.
like that. Yeah,
Yep.
I was on all those and stuff, and I started writing very seriously a sci-fi book for a number of years, and then I realized that I was struggling with it. I was having some problems, and then I moved up to the Bay Area to do video game work, which I was like, oh well, maybe I can throw myself into this, and kind of stopped writing for a while. About a year into living up there, I met my friend Matthew, who I actually do my own podcast with about
Oh,
DC
nice.
Comics.
Yes, and shout out to that.
Yeah, the DC Detectives. We are chronologically reading DC Comics from the company's beginning, and that is, I gave myself book
Wow.
report. I gave myself book reports for fun. That was the dumbest idea I've ever had. Um,
You are just so passionate, John.
oh yeah, it's I care a lot about a lot of stuff, and that will bite you in the ass at some point. Um, it just does. It tires you out. Take breaks. Self care is important.
Yep.
But Matt and I were talking about I believe it was Marvel Civil War, the original Civil War storyline, that I believe, um, God, I'm drawing a blank on the writer's name, but we were not fans of it. Mark Millar had written Civil War,
Mm.
and we were not terribly taken with it. And honestly, that was probably the last comic series I had read up until that point because I was just so upset with it, and it had bothered me. I didn't want to read comics for a while because it was too hard to keep up with.
Hmm.
And we started talking about like, well, Civil War kind of has an interesting point about like registration and superheroes and people trusting, masked vigilantes. And we were talking about that. Mind you, this was like 2 o'clock in the morning after we'd been drinking in the middle of the street.
That's when the best ideas come.
Yeah, I had been walking him to his car, and then we had just not stopped talking, and then we just kept talking. And he was like, well, how would that look then? And I go, what do you mean? He goes, well, how would it look? Like registration, what would that even look like? And we like talked about how legally it's kind of impossible to regulate people. It should be impossible to regulate
Hmm.
people based off of things that are outside their control with regards to their body. That's a human rights violation according to the United Nations, I believe.
Hmm.
And we're like, yeah, you wouldn't be able to get away with that unless the UN said it was okay, which they probably wouldn't.
Hmm.
So in the real world where there's no shield, you'd have to be like, okay, well, there's these people on our planet that have special superpower abilities. We can't tell them that it's illegal for them to do that because it's telling them like it's like stop being colorblind or
Yeah.
stop running so fast. It's like you can't do that. That's not possible. Stop breathing underwater, super person.
Yeah.
Like that's illegal. It's like, yeah, you can't really do that unless everyone agrees that it's not okay. So the UN would probably be like, look, you can't just let them circumvent the law because it's kind of dangerous. So if you want to regulate how these people use their powers with regards to collateral damage and saving people's lives, that's something that you can do. And that
Mhm.
was kind of the way we started to create the Citizen Defenders Initiative, which is the major governing piece of law in the world of Veritas, which is a UN um, document that essentially says as long as your society agrees, like your national government and national sovereignty agrees that the way that these people can help the citizens of your country by protecting them is by using their powers, and you regulate it with according to the laws of your country, we're
Mhm.
okay with this. Anyone who isn't doing this the legal way has to be arrested, though.
In terms of the superior people, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So it's never a regulation of, hey, you can't use your super strength when you work at a steel mill to lift things. It's more if you want to save people's lives, you have to do this the way that we tell you to.
Mhm.
And if you don't want to do that, we're not going to make it illegal for you to run very fast. We're just going to make sure that you're doing that safely. If you don't go and do this the legal way and you start saving people's lives as a vigilante, that's illegal.
Mhm.
So we kind of came up with this whole idea of like, well, it's kind of like CPR training. You take it for like 6 months or a couple weeks or something like that. And then it's like, okay, I now am qualified to stop a mugger.
Yeah.
And you have a little card. And when you stop a mugger and the police show up and you show them your card, they go, okay, cool. Thanks. You did the thing the right way. We're going to take the mugger. We appreciate it. So anybody who does these Citizen Defender Initiative crash courses is legally qualified to be essentially a first responder. And they have to, renew this every year. So it's like, you're up to date. You're not, slacking or whatever. But then you get the characters like Veritas and Shield Maiden, who
Hmm.
want to do this as their job. So they have to do like a year's worth of work, Veritas specifically, um, in these training situations to learn, okay, you can't throw cars, you can't bust up windows, you can't destroy the street. This, if you're going to be a superhero, these are the things that you have to avoid doing because legally these are problems, and
Yeah.
the city and the state can't pay for your collateral damage. So we're going to train you how to be a superhero within the letter of the law. Shield Maiden is his mentor, and she is there to kind of basically do ride-alongs with him. The two of them go out together to show, okay, we can do this within the law. This is how you do your job. This is what they want us to do now. This is how this works. And, Matt and I went back and forth for hours going like, okay, but like, some people aren't going to want to do that. Some
Hmm.
people are going to want to be vigilantes because they're going to be like, I don't want to sign a piece of paper. I know what I'm doing. I did this for years. And then there's going to be some people who are like, yeah, but like what if we did this overseas? What
Hmm.
I don't want to help America. I want to help this country. And we kind of went down all those rabbit holes. And
Right. The blurry lines of the law at that point, right?
exactly, yeah. And so there are things that are going to happen in the story as it continues that are going to show those people, the different types of people who are using their powers in the different ways, and how the society has kind of evolved into a powers accepting society without it being like, thousands of people flying in the air.
Right. It's not a normal thing.
Yeah, I mean, it is normal, but it's kind of the idea that like, Veritas doesn't really fly everywhere because it's cold.
Yeah.
Like
Right, right.
wind chill factor and wearing goggles all the time and dressing so that he could fly, presumably everywhere he wants is a lot to do. So he just would rather take the subway, you
Yeah.
know. And that's kind of how this world works, is that it's very conscious of reality and physics, but not so much so that you can't play around with it, but in the idea that I'm not going to have the New York skyline drawn and you're going to see tons of people flying because it's not smart.
Yeah.
If it's,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
just, I wouldn't do that if I
yeah.
could fly. After a certain point, it's going to be like, I don't want to fly in 40-degree weather in the middle of a snowstorm.
Yeah.
I'm going to take a bus, or something or whatever. Um, and speedsters, it's like, it's really hard to run through traffic.
Yeah.
Like I'll just walk, it's not that far or comparatively or whatever. It's like you would really only use your super speed if you had straightaways with no cars,
Right.
and
Yeah.
and that's not, you otherwise it's just weaving in and out of traffic on daily and you get sick doing that kind of a thing. Um, so I tried to make it realistic without being boring, which is a very hard thing to do.
Yeah. Well, and you do it really well, John, and that's why I definitely wanted to get you on the podcast because just like you're saying, Veritas is, I think, just like everything you've just been saying, is it's taking those kind of concepts that you had been reading from comics, even from childhood, and then kind of applying a logic to it that we experience. And I think that that's really cool. And so, what I wanted to get on with that is kind of an element of the story writing process that we've kind of touched on a little bit, and that is with the citizens' defense movement. There was already superheroes before that as kind of the vigilantes, right? I kind of want to just make sure everyone listening understands that part of it as well.
Yeah, there were definitely superheroes before um the Citizen Defender Initiative was enacted. And that was part of the reason why it had to be made, was because you had characters who were kind of like that Batman, that Superman sort of vibe, but they weren't able to be reached, when they destroyed a building.
Hmm.
And people were kind of pissed off about that because they're like, well, now taxpayers have to pay for this destruction that you've caused while stopping a single individual. Thanks, buddy. You know,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that's a very real human reaction to someone with superpowers doing what they think is right and everyone having to pick up the slack because of their personal code. Regardless of how in the right that they are, nobody wants to pay taxes for somebody else's screw up.
Yeah. Right.
Because like you shouldn't have to do that. It's not your fault. You didn't do that
Right.
thing. Why would you have to do that? Why are you being, and that's kind of a holistic just person thing,
Yeah.
regardless of like policy or whatever. It's like if someone crashed a car, that guy should pay for it. It's his screw
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
Like he screwed up. I don't want to pay for that. And so it's kind of the same concept applies to superheroes. And so there was, and this is kind of, I've hinted to this a little bit in the comic, but I can tell you because it's a world building thing that isn't necessarily secret, but it is part of the world.
Mm,
There was a 10-year period between the Citizen Defenders Initiative being enacted and when this comic starts,
mm,
where the superheroes essentially had to decide what they were going to do. And when which I kind of say like early 2010, like 2009, 2008 is when the Citizen Defenders Initiative is enacted.
mm.
And they talk about the idea, during that time period, they talk about, okay, this is now law. Who's going to sign up? Who of us who've been doing this for years is going to want to do this crap? And like who wants to, get recertified for a thing that you've been doing for 10 years before this? And some of them didn't. Some of them were very much like, I shouldn't have to sign a piece of paper to do the goodness that I want to do out of the kindness of my heart.
Mm.
Like I
Right.
have never asked for money. I've never asked for compensation. All I want to do is help people. Screw this, I'm out.
Right. Yeah, now you're just throwing restrictions on me to help people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's a very real reaction to being told you have to do something when you've already done it for a long time. And it's, screw that. I don't want to do that. So you've got those people. You've got the people like Shield Maiden, who had been a sidekick for many years. And she just wants to help people. And so in her mind, she's like, if this gets me to help people, I'll do it. I don't care. I just want to make sure that I'm doing the thing that I know how to do. Because for her, it's not about her, it's about the people,
Mm.
which is kind of that humble ego thing that I talked about earlier. It's, what do you want to do versus what are you trying to do for people?
Hmm.
And for her, she's doing something that is mostly a selfless act, which is saving other people's lives and risking her own. And in her mind, she's like, I'm already doing something that's selfless. Making this about me and how I want to do this makes it selfish.
Yeah.
And so she agreed. And then you have the folks who were like, well, how do I make money out of this? Because no one's been paying us. So if we're going to be a legal thing now, how do I make money off of my powers?
Right. Yeah. Oh, it's so interesting. I love this story, man. It's so good. I'm just thinking about it, and I just love the different, not only characters that you've come up with, but just kind of like the different, worldview and philosophies of each of them, so that it influences those actions. And I do want to talk more about that in a second. But what I kind of want to get from real quick before we get too much into the characters is. So you were talking about it with your friend Matthew, and then how did that come into being as a story? Does that make sense? Like,
Oh yeah. We talked about the characters and certain people, and we kind of made these ideas of like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we did this and this, and that would be neat, and if these would be what the vigilantes were doing at the time, and then you'd have these people who are doing whatever. It was hard to kind of figure out where you would start, and I said to Matt, I was like, you've got to have someone who's done this before and someone who hasn't,
mm,
so you can show sort of what it was like and what it is like. Otherwise, the reader's going to get confused. Is like, is this how this has been the whole time? I don't, what is this world actually like? So it was
mm,
important for me to kind of find a way to show how this world existed without having an entire paragraph of word balloons on every page and explaining
yeah,
every, and that's hard. I mean, you can do
yeah,
that. If you're Mike Mignola and you write Hellboy, you can put soliloquies all over your comic and no one will care because
yeah.
it's Hellboy and
Uh-huh.
it's amazing and it's beautiful and it's gothic and it's lovely. I'm not Mike Mignola, and
Yeah.
I can't do that because part of my concern was not knowing how to stop.
Mm-hmm.
And that was why I stopped writing that sci-fi book, because I was like, I don't know, Like, I know how I want to end this, but I'm just going to keep writing. I need to do something that I can finish. So after toying with it and brainstorming about it and driving around in traffic and thinking about it and talking to myself about it, I was like, okay, what if I like wrote issue one? Anyway, let's see how long it takes me to write one issue. And so if you actually look at Veritas, issue one is 31 pages,
Wow.
um, which is not a standard size for an issue. I mean, Image Comics can get to that point, but usually the monthly issues of a comic don't really exceed 24 or 26 pages. And I was like, okay, I finished one. This is 31 pages. That's kind of a lot. I don't know how much more I want to take out of this. Let's see if I can write one that's 24 pages. And then I did issue two, and that was 24. And I was like, okay, let's see if I can do another one that's a 24. And I did issue three, and I was like, oh, I've written 3 issues of a comic now. I suppose I should just write this arc. And I wrote 4, 5, and 6. And it was a very different story. I want to say 4 years ago, because it's how long I've been working on Veritas. It's been
Oh, wow.
several years. I had 2 other artists before Davis,
Mm-hmm.
and each of them was an entirely different style. And I was looking at getting this published through a company that does indie comics, and then that company and I stopped talking, and
Hmm.
I have to do this. I'm doing it the way that I'm doing it now. And that outline was vastly different than what there is now for Veritas. There were characters that I'm now not planning to introduce for dozens of issues,
Mm-hmm.
that were already in there, that were just there, doing stuff. The timeline was vastly sped up. I mean, I think if I remember correctly, it was supposed to be like a year after Shield Maiden and Veritas had been paired up together,
Mm.
as opposed to the first year that they were. I was like, screw that. We're going to do a jump. I don't want to explain everything. We're going to do it in flashbacks. And then I realized, no, no, you can't do that. You gotta actually kind of explain what you're doing. And
Mm.
so I ended up rewinding a year and changing the entire thing. And it was the best decision, because it would have been so hard to
Yeah.
to explain myself after the fact.
Right.
Um, it's easier to explain lore that isn't right now eminent on the story, as in like the world building, which is what I
Mhm.
use the classroom scenes for in Veritas.
Yeah.
Um, it's easier to use those and to do that with that information than it is to do it with information that is absolutely crucial to the plot at the given moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just because people understand a linear sequence of events far better than, wait, when did that happen? Oh, is that a flashback? How many flashbacks have we had this volume, these issues? Oh, it can get confusing. And I'm like, screw that. You're just gonna see it as it happens. Anything that happens in the past is gonna be talked about in that classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of my denotation for the reader. Anytime you see the classroom, you're gonna learn some stuff that has happened before.
That's cool. That's awesome. Now, would you say that you kind of learned that because you'd written those first 6 issues, or was it a combination of because you'd written those first 6 issues and see what's working and what isn't, plus kind of your years of reading comics and knowing what other people had done and what you liked and didn't like? Would you say that that played into it?
I mean, it was definitely kind of an exercise in understanding the kind of writer that I also was too.
Mm.
Writing the 6 issues, I was like, wow, I tend to do this a lot, and I don't really like how that reads. So I would change things, and then I would change more, and then I would have people read it, and then I'd go, I don't really like the feedback I'm getting in that, so I'm going to change it. And it helps to be a consumer of the product that you're trying to create. I definitely read a lot of, Atomic Robo to kind of be like, okay, how minimal can I make a page? And Atomic Robo usually only has anywhere between 3 and 4 panels a page. And it is a
Mm.
fascinating comic, and it's really well done, and it has visual gags, and it's really funny. And I was like, I just want to see how you can do this with the least amount of work possible.
Mm.
And then I got Hellboy, and I was like, how much work can I do for myself? How
Hmm.
intricate can I make something? And then I read Powers for a while because I was like, okay, this is gonna more gritty, realistic sort of a thing. What does that look like? And I, studied kind of what noir looked like on comics. And then I was like, okay, now let's look at superhero comics again to kind of look at what fight scenes look like and what, you know, how they deliver information
Mm-hmm.
in a sort of genre that is much more focused on sort of action and like an action movie in general. It is a lot of self research and understanding who you are as a writer, and also understanding what you like and what comics you gravitate to. Now that's great to figure out what you want to write. And if you're going, I want to write a comic like Green Lantern, fantastic. Read a bunch of Green Lantern, read Nova Corps, read Guardians of the Galaxy, read Star Trek comics, read anything sci-fi where it's about people flying out into space, learning a thing, and then coming back and thinking about that thing. But if you want to take a stab at a genre you're not terribly familiar with, maybe look at Hellboy. Or, like, I want to write a mystery comic. Great. Fantastic. Look at these types of comics. There's a phenomenal series that I really like called Thief of Thieves, which is, I think, the only Ocean's 11 heist movie sort of comic I've ever seen.
Oh, wow.
And it's awesome. And I love the series because I'm like, this is such a visual genre of stories. Like,
Mm.
heist movies and heist stories in general always have to do with intricacies and little tells that people have and the sequence of events and like revealing it at the end. I'm like, how do you even do that visually without film?
Right.
And
Wow.
I just wanted to see how that worked. And a lot of it is going out of your comfort zone, trying things that you've never tried before, pushing yourself to write something that you want to do, and then see how it lands. There's a visual gag in issue 5 that for 3 years I was worried nobody would understand, and I until it came out, and I was like, oh god, I hope this is funny. I don't know if it's funny,
Oh,
and I
yeah.
just sat there. It's like a comedian, like, working on their type 5 at the Comedy Store, and they're just like, god, I hope this joke is funny, and you won't know until somebody laughs. And for
Oh, that's
comics, you're like, I won't know if this is funny until people read it.
wow.
And 3 people have messaged me, this was hilarious. And I was like, oh, okay, I can do visual comedy. I can
Good.
do simple visual comedy. That's perfect. Because if I couldn't and it wasn't funny, I just wouldn't do it again.
Right. Yeah.
It's a lot of taking chances and going, I hope this works. Did it work? Yep. Okay. Let's
Yeah.
put that into the box of things that I know how to do now. And
Yeah.
it stays in there, and we're going to take it out very, very, sparingly, but just know that we can do this. Because that's also part of it, is you don't want to oversaturate the reader with things that you are good at, because then they're going to get bored of it.
Right.
If you do a lot of visual gags, they're going to expect it, and they're just be like, oh, there's another one. And then they start to grade them and place them. That one wasn't as funny as that one, or that one is funnier, and I like this one better because that gag is funnier. And you don't want that to happen. You just want people to be like, oh yeah, he's doing that thing again, or she made that joke again. That's funny. I like that. And it's a surprise kind of a thing.
Yeah, and I think that's cool, and I definitely see that in your work too, and like, I think it's cool that you are shouting out to everybody these comics that helped you write your comics, because I think that's kind of the same thing. Is you're building up the tools in your tool belt so that you can use them at the right times. I think that's super awesome, and a good note for everyone who's looking at writing their own comics. And that's kind of a question I wanted to get into before we get kind of deeper into the writing of Veritas. Is what would you say were some of the things that really, in terms of like just writing, helped you write your own comic?
There's a lot of books out there about writing, and one of my favorite books, I think, is Writing Comics the DC Comics Way, which is written by Denny O'Neil, who is a very, very fantastic writer for DC Comics and was an editor for a very long time for them. Um, one of the things that he reiterates in his book is there are absolutely no immutable rules for writing.
Hmm.
He gives you guidelines for how he writes and how he preferred to write and how he edited Batman and Green Lantern for a long time and how he would tell people what he would like. But he always stresses pretty much at the start of every chapter, there is no right or wrong way of doing this.
Hmm.
Don't get caught up in doing this the way that you think you should. Just do the thing and make it good. That's a subjective term, but you can kind of understand what works and what doesn't by seeing what other people do. Obviously, the first tool I would say is if you're going to, like I said, consume the product with which you are going to create. If you're going to be a movies writer, watch a lot of movies, buy a lot of scripts, get books that have movie scripts in them, watch YouTube videos about, movies that are being analyzed for the writing or anything like that. And also recognize you don't have to agree with everything that you see.
Hmm.
You don't have to like everything that's ever been written. If you really don't like the Incredibles, and everyone does, that's okay. But you should
Yeah.
at least, you should at least look at that as a really interesting study of how you could write a family movie that also happens to be about superheroes. That's what you should take away from it, kind of a thing.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, just like you were saying, is that's basically what you and your friend Matthew did about the Civil War comics, right?
Yeah. And it can be difficult to consume and dissect a lot, because you'll start to do that naturally, and it's hard to turn that off once you've started that machine. I would also say find stuff that you can just switch your brain off with, because that will help you relax. If you were constantly in school for your work, reading things to dissect them, watching things to understand how visually that could work or how that information is delivered, find something that's just candy for your brain. You need it. I love video games purely for that reason, because um, I'm interacting with it and I can't take the time all the time to dissect it. Now, because I work in the video game industry, that's kind of changed, and all I can see now are bugs and things like that,
And floating houses.
and floating houses. But I also love like cartoons. I love cartoons so much because they're fun, they're bright, they are sometimes very beautifully naive and simple in their stories, and that's great. And sometimes they can be really complex, like the Young Justice cartoon, or lots of anime is incredibly complex, but it's beautifully drawn, and it's just something to feed my brain. I also just love watching comedy shows because I'm like, okay, I need to not think about something that's heavy or that's complicated. I'm gonna watch Letterkenny or Brockmire or Brooklyn Nine-Nine or something like that,
Mhm.
just to switch my brain off. And you need that to rest your head. But you should also be constantly outside of that. This is on my pull list, or this is a book that I want to read, or um, this is a new book about writing comics that I want to look at. Have those there.
Hmm.
Do you have to read them all immediately? No, you don't. You should read them at some point because you spent money on it, presumably.
Yeah.
If you're stealing books, don't tell me. I don't want to. I
Yeah.
don't want to be a witness against you. Um,
Right.
but try and this is the hard part that school never taught you. Going out of your way to study something you want to study.
Hmm.
School was a lot of studying things that you needed to study to get into a better school.
Hmm.
This now, that was all training for this moment for you as a creator. Now you know how to do homework, how to do book reports, how to research, how to, test yourself on your knowledge, how to complete a project because you had to do so many friggin' projects in school. You know how to do all that. You just haven't done it in a while
Mhm.
because you're not in school. Presumably you're, working right now, or even if you're not, it doesn't matter. You
Mhm.
now have the opportunity to pursue anything you want because the internet is available to you. And that is the biggest, I think, tool for everyone, regardless of their level of privilege or where they live. The internet's available to you, and you have the possibility to just dive down these holes of learning that are what you want to learn. So presumably, it's more fun than learning about the War of 1812.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe that's what you want to write a movie about. In that case, that's probably your jam. But
Mhm.
if you have the time now, it's taking the time to do it. A lot of it is also doing the thing. You have to put the work in. If you don't, it's not going to happen. The hardest part about writing is it doesn't happen unless you do it.
Mm-hmm.
No script is going to complete itself until you actually finish it. No comic is going to be done so that your artist can draw it if you don't write it. No book is ever going to get published if you don't put the words down. If you have picked writing as a thing you want to do, a lot of the pressure is on you.
Mm.
And the responsibility is on you to actually make it. That's something you have to teach yourself how to do. If that's writing a poem every day and just saying, I know I can write something every day. Even if you don't really like it, you maybe don't have to like it. You just have to say, I know I can complete something. Awesome. Now let's see how long it takes for me to complete something that I like. Okay, maybe that takes a week. Okay, that's fine. You know that it takes you a week to complete a poem that you enjoy. You now have a timetable. See if you can do that to 3 days now. Now, see if you can do it in a day. Okay, now you know that you can create poems in a day that you like and you're happy with. Awesome. Write something longer. Write a page of words. Okay, you don't like that. How long does it take you to write a page of words that you like? Okay, 2 weeks. Awesome. You now have, let's get it down to a week. It's a lot of setting goals that work for you on your timetable that make you satisfied. Because a lot of people are going to say, oh, well, if you just write a bunch every day, you're going to get good at writing. That's not how that works. Like, if you write 200 words a day, you could rewrite those 200 words tomorrow because you don't like them.
Mm-hmm.
So you've taken one step forward, 2 steps back. Because a lot of writing is being happy with your own work and learning how to be happy with imperfection. And you can only do that by finding what makes you happy in your own work and what you can live without. So there's stuff in Veritas that I rewrite all the time. There are jokes that I've just dropped because I'm like, it doesn't work for this moment, or the art doesn't match that line. I have cut and killed my darlings a lot. And it happens. It's just a thing you have to do. But anything that I've written now that is in front of the reader is something that I have said I'm okay with people seeing. And I wouldn't know what that is if I didn't write stuff that I was okay with.
Yeah.
Because you're not only are you writing for yourself to be happy with what you've created, you're also writing presumably so that someone can read this.
Right.
So write something you're happy with, then figure out what's something you think other people would be happy reading. And those are two very different things sometimes. And that's hard. But I would definitely say the biggest thing to really get into and comfortable writing is finishing something that you're happy with. Because again, someone's going to say, oh, if you write 200 words a day, you'll have a whole book by the end of the year. That's not what you want, because maybe you don't like that book. Write till you're happy. Then write till you're happy again and again and again and again. And then you know that you can produce work that you're comfortable with. That's the holy grail, is being happy with your own work.
Yeah, that's awesome, John. I feel like you're hitting on like the perfect artist struggle in whatever industry or area of art you find yourself in, whether you're a hobbyist or you're doing it professionally like you are. Being happy with your own work, and then like you're saying, not just writing every day or drawing every day, which you hear a lot, but being purposeful about it and looking to grow those skills. That's awesome, man. Great advice.
Intent is really important. If you're making this for just you, that is amazing, and you are doing that's a form of self-care, and I 100% support it. Because if this makes you happy, you should do it. And it's a low-cost hobby because it's writing. And if you have a word processor or a phone or literally a pen and paper, you can write for you and be happy. Oh my God, that's great. It doesn't, you don't have to get a computer. You don't have to buy art supplies. Even if you want to paint, that's fine too. But if you can make something that you're happy with, there is no price you can put on that level of satisfaction. That is the greatest feeling in the world, of being like, I painted that. I made that song. I can play that instrument. I can dance that way. I've learned how to speak this language and it makes me happy. That's the thing that you should be chasing. And if you can chase that effectively, and then you're like, well, maybe I want to put this in front of people, that's a whole different ball game. And that's when you're playing the major leagues, is putting something you're happy with in front of other people who may not be happy with it.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. Hey guys, thanks for tuning into part 1 with John Sollitto. I really enjoyed getting to talk with John, and I really enjoyed getting to record these 2 parts, so stick around for part 2 where we dive a little bit deeper into John's specific comic, Veritas. And since part 2 will probably be out in roughly around 2 weeks or so, that gives you guys time to check out the comic, so when we talk about his comic on the next episode, you guys will be super informed. But really, his comic really is great. And so you can check it out at veritascomic.com, or you can also go to Twitter. It's Veritas Comic, or at Veritas Comic. And you can also check out the artist that John referred to in this episode. That's Davis Dominguez. And on Twitter, he's at Davis GD, and Davis, not like my last name Davis, it's DEIVISGD. Really fantastic comic artist. And if you guys want to learn more about comics, because John and his friend Matt, as we talked about in this episode, really have an extensive knowledge of comics, as in their podcast, they're going through basically all the Justice League characters of the DC universe from the very beginning up to date. So if you guys want a fantastic podcast to listen to, it's the DC Detectives podcast, and you can find them on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud. And then be sure to follow them on Twitter and on Instagram. They're DCD Podcast. So if you want more knowledge about comics, check out the DC Detectives Podcast. And check out our next episode, in which John delves deeper into his own personal comic. And before we end this episode, we've got shout-outs from the web. So, this week, we are covering a lot of different artists because I forgot to do a shout out last time. So, shout outs to illustrator Garrett Nicole. If you're looking for some amazing illustration, check out his work there. And once again, you can find the spelling for all of these Instagram handles on our Instagram, which is Up and Coming Artist Podcast. So be sure to check out Garrett's work. He's a friend of mine. Also, check out Blinky's1, who does some fantastic illustration and enamel pins, really great stuff. Also follow, for concept design, Lily Jane's Creations, as well as voice actor, comedian, studio recording manager at VO Chick Michelle, and also her group at soundbox.la. You can also follow, for some really cool street art, One Dios Art. Following up with another friend of mine, storyboard artist and just fantastic illustrator, and also illustrator of some fantastic comics, my friend at Andy Manley. And then another good friend of mine who does production, but also some really fantastic paintings, and that's kind of what we've put up on the Up and Coming Artist podcast page, is my friend at Cassidy_creates. Next up, character designer, concept artist, Nellustration. Really great stuff. I'm really digging the kind of heavy black to like white contrast in her work. We also have, since we're talking about comic books, we have the comic book artist, Charles the Moore. So be sure to check out all these fantastic artists on Instagram. While you're there, check out John's podcast, check out his comic, veritascomic.com, and then check out our next episode with John in part 2. Thanks again for listening, everybody, and in whatever area of art you enjoy, keep on creating.